Amen. So as I mentioned, we do have a guest speaker today, and Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, again, was supposed to be with us a year ago in person, and then again today in person, but has restrictions as far as flying from the UK. And so I've just wanted to re-engage us in that relationship with him as we will have opportunities to partner with him perhaps over this next year. So I wanted to go ahead and reintroduce you all to him now. Reverend Dr. Gary Mason is a Methodist minister and holds a PhD from the School of Psychology at the University of Ulster. He was also awarded an honorary doctorate in divinity for his role in peace building in Ireland from Florida Southern College. He completed his theological studies at Queen's University and holds a bachelor's in business studies from the University of Ulster. He is not serving a local church right now, but is the founder and director of Rethinking Conflict. The organization seeks to model the principles of the historic Good Friday Agreement. He delivers this through building peace and reconciliation at the sharper, more fractured edges of society. And in the course of life and ministry, Gary has been involved in the Irish peace process, and he has taught all over the world, and here in the United States, he's taught at Boston College, Boston University, Duke, Florida Southern, University of Alabama. The list goes on and on and on. And so we are blessed to have the Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, even if it's through video. And so I hope you'll be blessed by this message based on the Good Samaritan.
Let me bring you greetings, my colleagues and friends and fellow Methodists in Pasadena Community Church in St. Petersburg. As many of you know, I'd hoped to deliver this sermon in person from the pulpit, which I preached in, I guess, about 8 or 9 years ago, and then did a fellowship evening with you round about 4 or 5 years ago. But with the various restrictions at the moment, I'm confined still today to the island of Ireland. And I know you've been moving through this series over the last number of weeks. And I want to try to pull some of those strands, those threads together this morning as we wrestle with this thorny issue of what is reconciliation? What does it actually even mean? I grew up in a very contested space. As many of you know, the Northern Irish situation dominated global headlines for almost 3 decades. And in this tiny space of just 1.6 million people, we ended up with a conflict creating 47,000 injuries. We had 36,000 shooting incidents, 22,000 armed robberies, 30,000 people went through our penal system. We had 16,000 bombings and almost 4,000 deaths. I remember as a kid in 1972, we had a terrorist incident every 40 minutes. And sometimes those numbers seem small, but I often say to friends and colleagues in the United States, if I was to extrapolate those figures, and very simply put, if my conflict had have taken place in your space within the United States over a 30-year period, you would have had 700,000 people dead, 6 million political prisoners, 9 million injuries, 7 million shootings, and 3 million bombings. And as a person of faith, we wrestled, how does theology make sense in conflicted spaces? Or is theology just a fusty, musty, dusty concept confined to another generation with no relevance for our sophisticated 21st century? I would suggest the answer to that is no. But I also suggest that for those of us shaped by Wesleyan theology and Methodist theology of personal holiness and social holiness, compels us to engage in conflicted spaces. I want to read a passage to you, pretty well known, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the writer there, Luke, tells us on one occasion an expert stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he added, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law, he replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. You've answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this, and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He falls into the hands of robbers. They strip him of his clothes. They beat him. They leave him half dead. A priest happened to be going along the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. A Levite came to the place, saw him, passed by on the other side. A Samaritan, as he travelled, came to where the man was. When he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he takes out 2 silver coins, gives it to the innkeeper. Look after him till I return. I will reimburse you for any extra expense. And then Jesus asked the question, which of these 3 people do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, you go and do likewise. It's interestingly, many commentators looking at the church in the West today suggest that we have a fortress mentality. That we are primarily indoors listening to our own reassuring voices. That we build $1 million salt depositories in street corners, when in reality the church is meant to be a salt dispenser. The academic David Fitch, in his book The Great Giveaway, argues that new post-Enlightenment generations are cautious about the megachurch. He suggests they want community, places to connect, authentic lived truth. And Fitch comments, they respect truth that is lived. They're looking for a home, a community wherein a belonging can take root and the moral fabric of truth can be borne out. Postmoderns, Fitch suggests, desire something bigger to be transformed into. I remember reading that quotation a number of years ago, and the thing that struck me primarily was the phrase, they respect truth that is lived. What is a parable? Why did Jesus even tell them? They're really simply insights into reality in story form. And as we look at this parable today, as we look at the opening gamut there in relation to it, according to Luke, the questions of the lawyer are first spoken in an attempt to tempt Jesus. How many people in our churches, in our political world, spend their lives poking people with questions to tempt them? And so that's the context of the encounter. Testing. Tempting. And then the lawyer poses a very technical question. And it was a technical question that was on the mind of all Jewish nationals of the first century. From the Pharisees to the Essenes to Jewish citizens at large. And it was a question about identity. And if you were to drill below that, because remember, first century Palestine was awash with questions of identity, religion, and land. The three concepts that tore my space apart for 30 years and for centuries literally before that. Look at the Middle East today around the Israeli-Palestinian theater. It's a conflict around land, identity, and religion. So I ask you today, what are your identity questions in the United States? Because the question about identity that the lawyer asks is this: who is my neighbor? We don't know what the lawyer wanted or even hoped to hear from Jesus, but Luke tells us again he wanted to justify himself or his position. And I suppose for those of us who have been around churches know so many times our churches are filled with people who want to simply justify their position, not engaging with the other person's position. But what he heard was probably an incredible surprise to him, because Jesus ends up telling this story about a wounded person near Jericho. He talks about the robbers, a group who beat, rob a traveller, steal his possessions. They use the phraseology, they leave him half dead. And then he talks about the religious crowd, whom we know very well. Priests, Levites, part of the a religious and ethical establishment of the day. And literally, if any people should know the answers to such questions, it should have been these two characters. But neither of the two priests stop to investigate the crisis or even to help the person who was in crisis. And Jesus shows no interest at all in the reasoning of the priests as they briefly confront this human tragedy. The sparseness of the story, you almost want to say, Jesus, could you not have penciled in a little bit more detail? And maybe they were frightened. Were they maybe going to a religious service? Did they simply not care? Did they feel inadequate? The story is actually all the more powerful because Jesus doesn't answer these questions for us. And he talks about this person called the innkeeper. He helps. He's paid for his service, and he trusts the Samaritan that he will come back and compensate him if he's out any extra money. And then we meet this person called the Samaritan, the other. I'm always struck when I read this parable, by the way, Jesus carefully underplays the extent of the ministry of this Samaritan. He helps, he gives first aid, he exposes himself to possible danger from the robbers, he incurs some financial obligation. But the descriptions are really restrained. I mean, the Samaritan doesn't stop his journey, he doesn't take the victim back to Jerusalem, to his own home. He doesn't obligate himself for the rest of his life to financially care for this person. Jesus is too honest or good a storyteller to overstate the help of the Samaritan. But primarily what the Samaritan feels is compassion for another person. How do we interpret this parable in the 21st century? Because what Jesus actually did there was he transformed the word neighbour from a noun into a verb. Because he asked the lawyer the question, which person proved neighbour to the man who fell among thieves? So what Jesus was doing was asking the question, not who is my neighbour, but who is being a neighbour. Can I say to you folk in St. Petersburg, that is an absolute, profound difference. Because Jews of that day despised the Samaritans. They were not theologically correct. They were different to us, etc., etc. And sometimes we read this parable and we almost say it's pretty small scale. I know most of you folk listening to me today would have done the same. So perhaps the parable is not always about dealing medically with another person. Perhaps the parable has some deeper meanings that run alongside the compassion that the Samaritans showed. Because the Samaritans, to many religious Jews, were bottom of the pile. They were not on the same level as them. Theologically, they were not at the game. So in reality, this parable in many ways is a parable about the other. Those people we don't like. Those people we don't understand. Those people, the Samaritans, we don't want to engage with. And I know in your space as much as in my space, the politics of difference, the politics of religion have rocked your space as they have rocked my space for many, many years. And I know today there will be Republicans listening to me, there will be Democrats. When I'm in the United States, I stay in the home of both Democrats and Republicans. My wife Joyce and I have many friends across those political persuasions. And yet I grew up in a space where sectarianism was a way of life. It was literally a kind of a sectarian cockpit within this northern part of the island of Ireland, where questions of the other, the Samaritan, those who are different, those who live in a different space, those who interpret their theology in a different way are not like us. And so what do the politics of healing look like in my space? What do the politics of healing look like in your space? I want to move us just for a moment from that identity story of the other, the Good Samaritan, to the book of Isaiah just for a few minutes as we pull some of these strands together. Because the book of Isaiah, and I mean the whole book of Isaiah, provides this experiential and theological model of a community process. As a church, you have the title Pasadena Community Church. I assume that title is there for those who shaped it and brought it together, was to say our role is to engage with all the community, not excluding those who we may see as modern day Samaritans. Isaiah, as you probably know, covers many eras in Israel's history, spans over 2 centuries. And in reality, it's not surprising when the Christian writers and communities of the Christian Gospels wanted to articulate the significance of Jesus. They frequently borrowed images, quotations, metaphors from Isaiah. Actually, more than any other part of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so what the book of Isaiah offers, if we look at the politics of identity, the Samaritans among us, the other, not like us. It offers a model of pastoral experience. It models a process which takes seriously the politics of healing. And I suggest unashamedly to my fellow Methodists today, the United States needs a politics of healing. And so within the book of Isaiah, we have this theological, pastoral process. It's a sequence, it's a critique, a naming, and a release of imagination. Chapters 1 to 39 What happens there? We see the socio-economic and political critique of an unjust society. The key text, if you want to note it mentally or physically, is Isaiah 1 verse 10 to 23. And then we spill into the second section, chapters 40 to 55. And there's a public naming of loss, catastrophe, the trauma of exile, the processing of the community's hurt and displacement. Read Isaiah 40 in the first 11 verses. But then in the third section, chapter 56 to 66, we see a release of imagination to envisage a new beginning, a new future rooted in inclusion, in justice, and in peace. But what we sometimes do in the church is this. We individualize or we spiritualize the reading of the texts. Now these are Pasadena texts. These are community-based texts. They're transmitted through the memory of their community. And so the Good Samaritan steps into a religious space as an example to those who didn't want his space, didn't want his theology. They just simply didn't want him. Because my space as much as your space, to quote the late Jewish rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who uses the phrase linguistic violence. It has pained me deeply. On both sides of your political divide, to hear the linguistic violence used so many times, and yes, so many times by people of faith like us. And it's interestingly, the Jewish sages said, whoever speaks with an evil tongue kills 3 people. The one who says it, the one who accepts it, and the one about whom it is said. Another great Jewish theologian said, it was words, not machines, that created Auschwitz. Let me just say that again. It was words, not machines, that created Auschwitz. And in this encounter with Jesus, you had this well-read, well-versed, well-heed, articulate Jewish lawyer who wants to tempt Jesus or box him or expose him theologically. So he tests him and he tempts him. He wants to justify his particular position as the only position. And then Jesus just blows his theology apart. By introducing into the story the other. And he says to the skilled Jewish lawyer, the skilled Jewish theologian, I need you to go and do the same. And what Jesus was saying was very profound. He was saying that actually Christian identity supersedes any nationalistic identity. Be that Irish, British, American, Israeli, Palestinian, South African, French, whatever. Because what we do in contested religious spaces is this when we're dealing with identity. We make things that are temporal become eternal. Politics, let me assure you, having lived in a contested political space for all of my life, politics are not eternal. But the gospel is. And I'm going to suggest to my friends, colleagues, my fellow Methodists in St. Petersburg who proudly bear that title of a community church, and drawing on the Wesleyan theology that I alluded to earlier of personal holiness and social holiness. John Stott, the Anglican evangelical, talks about Methodist theology like a bird with 2 wings. Personal holiness and social holiness. But Stott suggests you cut off one of those wings, whoop, the bird collapses. And I want to suggest to you graciously, but compassionately, that I sometimes look at the Methodist Church globally and we've forgotten about that concept of social holiness. That basically, once we gather in worship and we are energized spiritually, our faith is meant to spill into the public space. And let me tell you why. In the words of George MacLeod, who says, I simply argue that the cross be raised again at the centre of the marketplace. As well as on the steeple of the church, I am recovering the claim that Jesus was not crucified in a cathedral between two candles, but on a cross between two thieves, on a town garbage heap, at a crossroads of politics so cosmopolitan that they had to write his title in Hebrew, Latin and in Greek, and in the kind of place where cynics talk smut, thieves cursed, soldiers gambled, because that is where he died, and that is what he died about, and that is where Christ's own ought to be, and that is what church people ought to be about. So I'm suggesting to you, as people of faith, who are wrestling at the moment in a contested political environment, we want to designate the other as the Samaritan, or a person who grew up in a different context to me as a Samaritan, who want to justify their position or test or tempt the other or make identity paramount within a temporal space. The only identity that is worthwhile is that eternal identity. You may carry an American passport, I may carry a British or an Irish passport, but St. Paul tells me ever so clearly. He says, Gary, your citizenship is in heaven. And that value system is more important than identity politics, which are temporal. Because I do know this, and all of you know this, when the final eschatological curtain falls on planet Earth, and one day it will not be Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Margaret Thatcher, Angela Merkel, Vladimir Putin, Mao Zedong standing on the stage. There will be one person called Jesus Christ, and they will all realize they were simply 2-bit actors in a drama produced by another person called Jesus Christ. So I want to ask you today, as you listen to this concept of reconciliation, of difficult conversations, of engagement. Jesus was pinned to the wall, we could say, in the first century by a person who wanted to talk about identity politics, and Jesus turned the conversation on his head and saying, don't ask me that question, who is my neighbour? I'm asking the question, who is being a neighbour? That is the eternal question. Those are the concepts we will all be judged on. And so Jesus tells us a simple story with a deep eternal meaning. And I ask you folk at Pasadena to be reconcilers in your contested space, and to realize that the person we follow, this very disturbing person called Jesus Christ, is eternal, not temporal. May God bless you.